The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 7-year-old Emma Richardson skipped out of her house, her white sneakers tapping rhythmically against the concrete driveway. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the air carried that peculiar autumn sweetness mixed with the smell of freshly cut grass from her neighbor's lawn. Emma had begged her mother to let her play outside for just one more hour before dinner, and after some negotiation, her mother had relented with a warning. "Stay in front of the house where I can see you from the kitchen window." Emma pulled a piece of chalk from her pocket, a vibrant pink color she'd been saving, and began drawing the familiar squares for hopscotch on the driveway. She numbered them carefully, 1, 2, 3, and so on, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on making the numbers perfect. The chalk dust tickled her fingers, and she paused occasionally to blow it away. Max, her golden retriever, lay nearby on the grass, his tongue hanging out, watching her with the devoted attention only a dog could muster. Max was more than just a pet. He was Emma's constant companion and, in many ways, her protector. The dog had been specially trained to recognize her anxiety patterns and respond with calming pressure when she became distressed, a skill Emma's therapist had suggested after the child had begun showing signs of panic disorder. Emma had just reached number 7 in her hopscotch game when something made her pause. It was a sound, the screech of tires turning onto her street too quickly, followed by the violent rumble of an engine shutting off just a few houses down. She looked up, curious but not yet alarmed. Cars came and went on Maple Street all the time, but then she heard something else, the unmistakable crack of breaking glass. Emma's small body went rigid. She straightened up slowly, her chalk still clutched in her hand. Max's head lifted from his paws, his ears perking up at the sudden noise. The dog's body tensed, as if he too sensed that something was wrong. Emma took a few tentative steps toward the edge of her driveway, moving with the cautious curiosity of a child who knew, at some instinctive level, that she should probably go inside but was compelled forward by the pull of the unknown. What she saw next would change the entire trajectory of her life. 3 houses down the street at the home of her elderly neighbor Mrs., a man was crouched beside a silver sedan, frantically reaching through the shattered driver's side window. Even from this distance, Emma could see his movements were aggressive and panicked. He was wearing a bright red hoodie, the kind that stood out like a flare against the suburban landscape, and his movements were jerky and desperate. As Emma watched, frozen in place, the man turned his head slightly, and she caught her first glimpse of his face. What she saw would be burned into her memory forever. A jagged scar running from his left eyebrow down toward his cheekbone, white and prominent against his skin. His face was angular and thin, his expression twisted with desperation and anger. Emma's heart began to pound so violently she thought it might burst through her small chest. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. This wasn't something she was supposed to see. This wasn't part of the safe, predictable world of Maple Street. In that moment, Emma understood with the intuitive wisdom children sometimes possess that she was witnessing a crime, an actual crime happening in broad daylight on her own street. The man reached deeper into the broken window, his arm disappearing up to his elbow. Then he, clutching something, a purse. Mrs. Purse. Emma recognized the distinctive pattern because Mrs. had shown it to her just last week, explaining that it was a gift from her daughter. The man stuffed it under his arm and began to turn, his eyes scanning the street. Emma realized with a jolt of pure terror that he might see her. She was standing on her driveway in full view, wearing her bright yellow shirt, a beacon of a small child who had wandered into something dangerous. Behind her, Max suddenly began barking, not his normal playful bark, but something deeper and more urgent. The dog had sensed Emma's fear and her distress signals, and his protective instincts had kicked into overdrive. His barks were loud and aggressive, the sound of an animal warning away a threat. The unexpected noise startled the man in the red hoodie. His head snapped up, and his eyes swept across the street, landing on Emma and Max for just a fraction of a second. In that moment, their eyes met. The terrified 7-year-old girl and the criminal who was stealing from her neighbor. The man's face registered alarm. He wasn't expecting to be seen. More importantly, he wasn't expecting the large dog that was now charging toward him, barking ferociously. The man cursed under his breath, a word Emma's mother had told her never to repeat, and suddenly he was moving. He sprinted toward a black sedan parked at the curb, a vehicle Emma hadn't noticed before. The dog's barks grew more frantic, more urgent. Emma stood completely still, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch. The man threw himself into the driver's seat of the black sedan, and the engine roared to life with a sound like a beast awakening. Max had reached the edge of Emma's property but didn't venture further, still barking his warning into the September afternoon. The black sedan screeched away from the curb with reckless speed, its tires squealing against the asphalt. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a scream. Then there was silence. Emma stood frozen on her driveway, her piece of pink chalk still clenched in her small fist. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. Her legs felt weak, as if they might give out beneath her at any moment. Max ran back to her side, his barking ceasing abruptly, replaced by a whine of concern. The dog pressed his nose against her leg, his trained response to her distress activating automatically. He leaned against her, providing the grounding pressure he had been taught to give. The world seemed to return to normal gradually. A bird chirped somewhere in the trees. A neighbor's wind chimes tinkled gently. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, but everything had changed. Emma's safe, predictable world of hopscotch and afternoon playtime had been invaded by something frightening and real. She turned slowly and walked back toward her house on unsteady legs, Max staying close to her side. She didn't call out to her mother immediately. She didn't tell her what she'd seen. Something in her, perhaps the instinct of a child who knew she'd been told not to leave the front of the house, made her stay silent. That silence would become a burden she would carry for the next 2 weeks, a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. But it would also become the foundation for something much larger than Emma could have possibly imagined at that moment, a journey that would ultimately change not just her life, but the lives of countless children who would come after her. The 2 weeks that followed the incident on Maple Street were the longest of Emma Richardson's young life. She moved through her days like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs., noticed the change almost immediately. Emma, who had always been an enthusiastic participant in class discussions, had become withdrawn and quiet. She stared out the windows during lessons, her pencil hovering over her worksheet without ever actually writing anything. During recess, instead of playing tag with the other children, she sat alone on the bench, watching Max through the fence of the school's dog park. At night, Emma lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, the glow-in-the-dark stars her father had installed casting faint green light across the walls. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, the breaking glass, the man in the red hoodie, the scar on his face, the moment their eyes had met. She wondered if the man remembered her. Did he know where she lived? Had he seen her face as clearly as she had seen his? These thoughts spiraled through her mind like frightened birds in a cage, keeping her awake until the early hours of the morning. Max seemed to sense Emma's turmoil. The dog remained glued to her side, as if worried she might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. He was more affectionate than usual, constantly pushing his head against her legs, lying across her feet while she did her homework, and following her from room to room with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed by her parents. Her mother, Jennifer Richardson, began asking gentle questions. "Are you feeling okay, sweetheart? You seem sad lately." Emma would shake her head and say she was fine, but the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. What kept Emma silent was a complicated tangle of emotions. She was afraid, terrified, actually, of what would happen if she told the truth. Would the man come after her? Would she have to go to the police station and talk to strangers? Would she get in trouble for being outside alone? Her mother had specifically told her to stay in front of the house, and technically, Emma had been on the driveway when it happened. The guilt mingled with the fear, creating a paralysis that seemed insurmountable for a 7-year-old mind. Then came the knock on the door. It was a Thursday afternoon, exactly 14 days after the incident. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with her mother, coloring in a Disney princess coloring book with markers that smelled like artificial fruit. Her father was at work. Max was napping in his bed in the corner. The knock was sharp and official sounding, not the casual knock of a neighbor dropping by, but something more authoritative. Jennifer Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly as she stood up and walked toward the front door. Emma's stomach dropped the moment she heard the knock. Some instinctive part of her knew what this was about. When the door swung open, a woman stood on the porch. She was tall and fit, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything in a single glance. She wore a leather jacket despite the mild afternoon, and a badge hung from her belt. Detective Sarah Martinez introduced herself with a firm but gentle voice, showing her identification. "May I come in?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't really a question. Emma's mother invited her inside, confusion and concern flickering across her face. They settled in the living room, the detective perching on the edge of an armchair while Jennifer sat on the sofa. Emma remained at the kitchen table, pretending to color, though her hands had gone completely still. She could hear every word. "There was an incident 2 weeks ago on Maple Street," Detective Martinez began, her voice calm and professional. "A car break-in at the home of Mrs. We have reason to believe your daughter may have been present in the area at the time. We've been investigating, and security footage from a nearby store shows the suspect. We've made an arrest, a man named. However, we need to speak with any potential witnesses." Emma's heart began pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the house could hear it. She set down her marker with trembling fingers. "I didn't know Emma had seen anything," her mother said, and Emma could hear the surprise and worry in her voice. Detective Martinez turned her sharp gaze toward the kitchen, where Emma sat frozen. "Emma, can I talk to you for a moment?" Emma's legs felt like jelly as she stood up and walked into the living room. Max, sensing her spike in anxiety, rose immediately from his bed and followed her, positioning himself directly against her leg. The detective's expression softened when she saw the service dog. "Is this your dog?" she asked. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to work. "He's a good boy," Detective Martinez said, and she sounded genuinely warm. She pulled out her phone and opened it to show Emma a photograph. It was a man's face, and even though the photo was taken under harsh fluorescent lighting in a police facility, Emma recognized him immediately. The scar, the thin, angular features, the sharp eyes that had looked directly at her across the distance of Maple Street. "Is this the man you saw?" the detective asked gently. Emma's mouth went dry. She couldn't speak. She simply nodded, her entire body trembling now. Detective Martinez put her phone away and leaned forward slightly. "You're very brave, Emma. I know this is scary. But what you saw is really important. This man has broken into several cars in your neighborhood and he's hurt people. He stole from Mrs. and he's done it to others too. If we can prove what he did, we can stop him from hurting anyone else." Emma's mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice filled with concern rather than anger. "I was scared," Emma whispered, and the dam suddenly broke. Her eyes filled with tears. "I was scared he would come after us, and I thought I would get in trouble because I left the driveway." Her mother pulled her into a hug, and Emma dissolved into sobs against her mother's chest. Detective Martinez waited patiently, giving them a moment. When Emma had quieted slightly, the detective spoke again, her voice careful and measured. "Emma, we might need you to tell a judge what you saw. It would help us make sure this man stays in jail so he can't steal from anyone else. Would you be willing to do that?" Emma looked at Max, who immediately responded to her distress by pressing his head more firmly against her leg. The dog's steady presence seemed to anchor her, to remind her that she wasn't alone in this. "Will Max be with me?" Emma asked quietly. "If that helps you," Detective Martinez said, glancing at Emma's mother, "we can probably arrange it." Emma took a shaky breath. "Okay," she said, her small voice barely audible. "I'll tell the judge what I saw." But even as she said the words, Emma felt a new kind of fear settling into her chest, a fear of what would happen when she had to relive that terrifying moment in front of a room full of strangers. The courthouse was an imposing structure of gray stone and tall windows, built to project authority and permanence. Emma stood on the courthouse steps with her parents, staring up at the massive brass doors, and felt her entire body go cold. This was the first time she was seeing the building where she would have to testify, and the reality of it crashed over her like a wave. In 3 weeks, she would have to walk into this building, ride an elevator up to the 3rd floor, and sit in front of a judge and jury and tell them what she had seen. The thought made her feel like she couldn't breathe. This was what the victim advocate had arranged, a pre-trial visit to familiarize Emma with the environment. Was a kind woman in her 50s with graying hair and warm brown eyes. She had been working with children who were witnesses in criminal cases for over 15 years, and she had seen countless kids terrified by the prospect of testifying. She took Emma's hand as they climbed the steps, and her touch was comforting in a way Emma desperately needed. "Remember," Emma said softly, "the more you see this place, the less scary it will be. Our brains are funny that way. When we repeat something, it becomes familiar, and familiar things feel safer." Inside the courtroom, Emma was overwhelmed by the sheer size of the space. The ceiling was impossibly high, disappearing into shadows. The benches were made of heavy wood and polished to a shine. The witness box where she would sit looked like it was miles away from where the jury would sit, all 12 of them staring at her, judging her, deciding whether she was telling the truth. The judge's bench loomed even higher, an imposing throne-like structure. "This is where you'll stand," said, gently guiding Emma to the witness box. Emma climbed the 2 steps and sat in the chair. Immediately, she felt small, smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. She could see the courtroom spread out before her in all its intimidating glory. This was where she would have to speak. This was where everyone would look at her. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma came back to the courthouse repeatedly. During each visit, would walk her through every aspect of the trial process. She explained the judge's role, the prosecuting attorney's role, and most importantly, the defense attorney's role. "The defense attorney's job is to make sure your memory is accurate," explained during one session. "He might ask you questions that seem confusing or try to make you doubt what you saw, but that's not personal. He's just doing his job. You need to stay calm and remember what you actually saw, not what he suggests you might have seen." Emma's stomach twisted at the thought of this. Someone was going to try to make her look like she was lying, or that she was confused. What didn't know was how deeply Emma's anxiety ran. At night, Emma had started having nightmares. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, gasping for air as if she were drowning. She dreamed of being in the courtroom and forgetting everything she had to say. She dreamed of face lunging at her. She dreamed of the judge banishing her as a liar, of everyone in the courtroom pointing and laughing at her. Her parents were deeply concerned. Emma's father, David Richardson, had taken time off work to spend more time with her. He would sit on the edge of her bed after she woke up from a nightmare, holding her hand until her breathing returned to normal. Her mother had taken her to see Dr. Lisa, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and anxiety. Doctor's office was nothing like Emma expected. Instead of being cold and clinical, it was warm and inviting. There were soft rugs, plants, comfortable chairs, and a shelf full of books and toys. Doctor herself was younger than Emma's mother, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that made Emma feel like she was the most important thing in the world during their sessions. "Tell me about Max," Doctor said during their second session. "Your mother says Max is a very special dog." Emma brightened slightly when talking about Max. She explained how the dog had been trained to recognize her anxiety symptoms and respond with calming pressure, a technique called deep pressure therapy. She described how Max could sense when she was about to have a panic attack and would position himself against her leg, grounding her, bringing her back to the present moment. Doctor listened intently, taking notes. Then she said something that would change everything. "Emma, what if we could bring Max to the courtroom with you when you testify?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really? Can we do that?" "I don't know yet," Doctor said honestly, "but let me look into it. It might require some permission from the judge, but service dogs have special rights in many places. If Max helps you feel calm and more able to tell the truth, that's actually something the judge might want." Over the next week, Doctor compiled documentation about Emma's anxiety disorder, about Max's specialized training, and about the psychological research showing that the presence of a trained service animal could significantly reduce anxiety and improve cognitive function in children testifying in court. She wrote a formal letter to judge, requesting an accommodation. The judge's response came back within 3 days. It was a formal letter, typed on official courthouse letterhead, and it was a conditional yes, but barely. "I have never allowed an animal in my courtroom," Judge wrote. "However, I recognize that we must balance the integrity of judicial proceedings with the welfare of child witnesses. I will allow the service dog to accompany the witness during testimony on one condition. The dog must be trained and under control at all times. Any disruption will result in immediate removal." When Emma heard the news, she felt a weight lift from her chest. Max would be with her. That changed everything. The night before the trial, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of every sound in the house. Max was asleep on the floor beside her bed, and occasionally the dog would twitch slightly, his paws paddling as if he were running through a dream. Emma hymned that ability to sleep peacefully. She went through the sequence of events one more time in her mind: the breaking glass, the red hoodie, the face, the silver sedan. She had rehearsed it so many times that the images felt worn, like old photographs handled too many times. But they were still clear. She still remembered everything. At some point near midnight, Emma got out of bed and climbed back under the covers with Max. The dog woke slightly and rolled onto his back, and Emma hugged him tightly, burying her face in his golden fur. This was what courage felt like, she realized. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do something terrifying anyway, especially with someone you loved by your side. Tomorrow she would walk into that courthouse. Tomorrow she would sit in that witness box. Tomorrow she would tell the truth in front of everyone, and Max would be there with her. Emma closed her eyes and finally found sleep. The morning of the trial arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Emma woke before her alarm went off, her eyes snapping open at 5:47 a.m. She had slept only in fragments, if what she'd done could even be called sleep. Her mouth was dry, her stomach churning with nausea that had been building since she'd gone to bed the night before. Her mother had laid out a pale blue dress on the chair in the corner of Emma's room, a dress Emma had picked out specifically because it made her feel brave, with little embroidered flowers along the collar. Emma stared at it for a long time before getting out of bed. Max lifted his head, his entire body shifting as he stood and stretched, understanding somehow that today was different, that today mattered. Breakfast was impossible. Emma's father made her favorite chocolate chip pancakes, but she could only manage a few bites before her throat closed up. Her mother didn't push. Instead, she braided Emma's hair carefully, her fingers gentle as she worked through the tangles. It was something her mother had done since Emma was small, a ritual of care and preparation. By 8:30 a.m. they were driving to the courthouse. The news vans were already parked outside, their satellite dishes raised like predatory birds. Emma's heart sank when she saw them. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was news. This was a story that people wanted to follow. There was a little girl and her service dog going to testify in a criminal trial. It was unusual enough to warrant media attention. A victim advocate from the courthouse met them outside and ushered them through a side entrance, away from the cameras. Emma caught a glimpse of reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, and then the heavy courthouse door was shutting it all out. The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded. There were attorneys in dark suits, police officers in uniform, and other people Emma didn't recognize. Everything smelled like cleaning solution and old wood. Emma's hand trembled as she held onto Max's leash. The dog sensed her fear and pressed against her leg, grounding her. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the prosecutor, Mr. Johnson, came over to Emma and her parents. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray at his temples and kind eyes. He had met with Emma multiple times during preparation, and he had always been encouraging. "You ready, Emma?" he asked, kneeling down to her level. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "Remember," he said, "I'm going to ask you some questions first. Easy questions. Just tell me what you remember. Then the defense attorney will ask you some questions. It might feel different, but you just stay calm and tell the truth. That's all that matters." They walked into the courtroom together and the world seemed to slow down. The room was packed. There had to be 50 people there, jury members, spectators, court personnel. Everyone turned to look at Emma as she walked in, and she felt their eyes like a physical weight. Max walked steadily beside her, his professional demeanor evident in every step, his presence already having a calming effect on some of the observers. Judge sat at her elevated bench, her expression stern and unreadable. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes. She glanced at Emma and Max, and something flickered across her face, perhaps doubt, perhaps compassion. It was impossible to tell. Then Emma saw. He was sitting at the defense table, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands in shackles. The face from her nightmares was right there in front of her, real and terrifying. When he saw Emma, he leaned toward his attorney and whispered something, then smirked. The expression on his face was cruel and dismissive, as if he didn't believe her testimony could hurt him. Emma's legs went weak. She was guided to the witness stand. The clerk of the court approached her with a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the clerk asked. "I do," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She sat in the witness box, and Max was positioned on the floor beside her, as close as the bailiff would allow. Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden box so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mr. Johnson stood up and approached her with a warm smile. "Hi, Emma. Can you tell me your full name?" "Emma Richardson," she said, her voice shaking. "And how old are you, Emma?" 7 years old. "Can you tell me what you were doing on September 19th at around 3:30 in the afternoon?" Emma took a breath. This was what she had practiced. This was the easy part. "I was playing hopscotch on my driveway with my dog Max." Mr. Johnson walked her through the incident gently. He asked about the sound of breaking glass, about the man she saw, about what he was wearing. Emma's voice grew steadier as she answered. She described the red hoodie, the face. She was doing it. She was telling the truth. The jury was watching her intently, and she could see belief in their eyes. Then it was time for the defense attorney to cross-examine. Mr. stood up slowly. He was a thin man with sharp features and colder eyes than Mr. Johnson. He approached the witness stand not as a friend, but as an adversary. "Ms. Richardson," he began, emphasizing the formal address in a way that felt mocking. "You say you clearly saw this man's face, but it was September, wasn't it? How bright was it that day?" "It was sunny," Emma said. "But you didn't get a great look at him, did you? He was far away. 3 houses down, you said." "I could see him," Emma said, but doubt was creeping into her voice. "And you were playing hopscotch, so you were distracted, correct? Your attention wasn't on this supposed criminal, it was on your game." "No, Isn't it true that you only looked at him for a few seconds? That you might be confusing details from other occasions? That children your age are notoriously unreliable witnesses? Emma's hands were trembling now. The room seemed to be spinning slightly. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might explode. All of Mr. objections and suggestions were beginning to make her doubt herself. Had she really seen the scar clearly? Had it been exactly the way she remembered? "I know what I saw," Emma said, but her voice cracked. "Do you?" Mr. pressed on. "Or do you know what you've been told to say? How many times have you spoken to the prosecutor's office? How many times have you rehearsed this story?" "I'm not lying," Emma whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. The room felt like it was closing in on her. Max shifted, aware of her distress, but he couldn't do anything yet. He couldn't break protocol unless Emma gave him the signal. Emma's vision began to blur. She could feel a panic attack building, a tidal wave of anxiety threatening to completely overwhelm her. Mr. continued his attack, his voice relentless. "When you look at the defendant now, are you really seeing the man from September 19th? Or are you seeing the man the police told you to identify?" Judge frowned slightly, but she didn't intervene. This was how the legal system worked. The defense had the right to aggressive cross-examination. Emma was expected to handle it. But Emma couldn't handle it. She was 7 years old and she was drowning in anxiety. Max pressed himself against her leg, whining softly, desperate to help but unable to until she gave him permission. Emma's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the edge of the witness box. A tear slipped down her cheek. This was the breaking point. This was the moment where everything could fall apart. And it was in this exact moment of crisis that Emma would need to make the secret signal that only Max understood. Emma felt like she was drowning. The fluorescent lights above seemed too bright, washing out everything in harsh white illumination. Mr.'s voice continued its assault, question after question, each one more accusatory than the last. Emma's chest was heaving with short, panicked breaths. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The edges of her vision were beginning to darken, closing in like a tunnel. She couldn't focus on his words anymore. All she could hear was the rushing sound of blood in her ears, like a river roaring through her skull. This was what panic felt like. This was what she had feared most, losing control in front of everyone, falling apart on the witness stand, being labeled as an unreliable liar. She looked down at Max and the dog's eyes were locked on hers, alert and ready. He whined softly, a small sound that only she could hear, his body vibrating with the intensity of his desire to help. Max had been trained for this. He knew what to do when she was in distress. But he was bound by rules and protocols that Emma's therapist had carefully instilled in him. He couldn't act without the signal. He wouldn't break the protocol, no matter how much he wanted to. The signal, Emma needed to give him the signal. But her mind was fragmented, scattered across 1,000 panicked thoughts. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't remember if she was supposed to. Then something deeper kicked in, something primal and instinctive. Emma's body remembered what her conscious mind had forgotten. Her right hand, trembling violently, moved almost of its own accord. Her fingers found the fabric of her pale blue dress, the material bunching under her shaking hand as she pressed it against her thigh. Tap. It was a single, deliberate tap against her thigh. The first part of the signal she and Max had practiced hundreds of times during their training sessions. The tap was followed immediately by a specific finger movement, a quick 2-finger gesture that completed the sequence. Tap gesture. That was the code. That was the command. That was the permission Max had been waiting for. For a split second, nothing happened. Emma held her breath, wondering if her panic had rendered her incapable of even giving the signal correctly. But then Max moved. The dog didn't simply stand up, which is what he was trained to do in many situations. Instead, Max did something he had only been commanded to do in the most extreme circumstances. He launched himself forward with graceful power, his muscular golden body moving with absolute purpose. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply moved as if propelled by decades of understanding human need rather than mere years of training. The bailiff made a move to intercept, but it was too late. Max was already leaping onto the witness platform, his front paws landing with a soft thud on the wooden step. The dog moved directly to Emma, and then, in a movement so practiced it seemed choreographed, Max placed his entire body against Emma's left side, her most vulnerable side, the side closest to the courtroom, the side most exposed to Mistress' attack. But it wasn't just a casual press. Max aligned his body perfectly, his shoulder against her ribs, his weight distributed precisely where a 7-year-old girl would most need grounding pressure. The dog's body became a weighted blanket of warmth and presence. Max's head turned up slightly, his chin resting against Emma's arm, his brown eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that spoke of absolute devotion and protection. The entire courtroom froze. The silence was absolute and complete. Even Mr. mid-sentence simply stopped talking. His mouth remained open, his hands suspended in midair, as if he had been paused mid-action. The jury members who had been watching the proceedings with the detached interest of professional observers suddenly leaned forward collectively, their entire bodies expressing shock and fascination. Judge's gavel froze in midair. She had been about to make a ruling regarding Mistress' latest objection, but the movement stopped entirely. Her eyes widened, and her expression transformed from stern judicial authority to something else entirely: surprise, wonder, understanding. In that single moment, the judge's face showed the dawning realization that something extraordinary was happening, something that transcended normal courtroom procedure. Sneering expression faltered. His confident demeanor crumbled as he watched a 7-year-old child and her golden dog create a moment of such profound connection that it seemed to rewrite the rules of the room. His hands, still in shackles, clenched into fists on the table. But the most dramatic transformation was Emma herself. The moment Max's weight settled against her, Emma's entire physiology shifted. Her rapid, panicked breathing slowed within seconds. The shallowness of her gasps deepened into more substantial breaths. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, dropped down. The tension drained visibly from her small frame like water emptying from a cup. Her hands stopped shaking. The tears on her cheeks seemed to dry themselves as if by magic. Emma took one deep breath, then another. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them again, they were clear. The panic was still present. Fear didn't simply evaporate because a dog pressed against you. But the panic was no longer in control. Emma was in control now. She was grounded. She was present. She was real. The courtroom remained in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then a sound rippled through the gallery, a soft collective intake of breath, as if everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. Mr., still standing, still holding his accusatory posture, suddenly seemed diminished. His aggressive energy dissipated in the face of what everyone in the courtroom had just witnessed. He looked at Judge uncertainly, as if asking permission to continue. Judge slowly set down her gavel. She leaned back in her chair, studying Emma and Max for a long moment. In that moment, it seemed like the judge was not just observing a legal proceeding anymore. She was witnessing something human, something that transcended the formality of her courtroom. Her stern expression had softened, replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect and understanding. The bailiff, who had been moving toward Max to remove the dog from the witness stand, stopped and looked back at the judge. The judge gave a subtle shake of her head, a gesture so small that only someone paying close attention would notice it. The bailiff stepped back. Emma took another deep breath. She looked directly at Mr., and when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and certain in a way it hadn't been just moments before. "I know what I saw," she said, and this time her words carried an absolute conviction that filled the entire courtroom. I saw a man with a scar on his face. I saw him wearing a red hoodie. I saw him break into Mrs. Carr and steal her purse. I remember all of it, and I'm telling the truth." The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. In that single moment, with a dog pressed firmly against her side, a 7-year-old girl had reclaimed her power. She had transformed from a victim of intimidation into a credible, compelling witness. She had shown everyone in that courtroom that sometimes the smallest signal, given at the right moment to the right being, could change everything. Judge's frozen expression finally thawed. She looked at Emma with something that might have been admiration. With Max's steady presence beside her, Emma felt like she had stepped into a different version of herself. The panic hadn't completely disappeared. She could still feel it lurking at the edges of her consciousness, waiting for any moment to surge back. But it no longer controlled her. Instead, she controlled it. She channeled it into focus, into clarity, into purpose. Mr. Johnson, the prosecutor, seemed to sense the shift in the courtroom's energy. He moved forward with renewed confidence, his earlier gentleness transformed into purposeful strategy. He began asking Emma more detailed questions, no longer asking her to simply confirm what she had seen, but to elaborate, to paint a picture for the jury that was so vivid they would have no choice but to believe her. "Emma," Mr. Johnson said, "when you saw the man, can you describe his face in detail?" Emma took a breath, her hand still resting gently on Max's head. The touch grounded her, gave her permission to speak. "He had a scar," she said. "A big one. It started above his left eye right here." She pointed to her own left eyebrow, and it went down. It was white like old skin, and his face was thin, sharp, like— Emma paused, searching for the words. "Like an angry bird." A few members of the jury actually smiled slightly at her description. It was childlike but accurate, and it had the ring of absolute truth. A child wouldn't have come up with such a specific comparison unless she had really seen it. "What color was his hair?" Mr. Johnson continued. "Brown, dark brown, and his eyes were mean, cold. Even from far away I could see his eyes were mean." Mr. Johnson nodded, allowing Emma's words to settle into the jury's consciousness. "You mentioned he was wearing a red hoodie. What else was he wearing?" "Dark pants and he had a ring." Emma's voice grew quieter, more thoughtful. "A silver ring on his right hand. It was shiny. I remember thinking it was pretty, which was weird because he was doing something bad." The courtroom's energy shifted again. This was new information. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened slightly. He had prepared for Emma to mention the ring, but he had never briefed her on it, never suggested it. This was spontaneous recollection, the kind of detail that prosecution teams dream about finding in a child witness's testimony. "Do you remember anything else about the ring?" Mr. Johnson asked carefully. "It had a skull on it," Emma said. "I think I saw a skull shape. It was shiny silver and it had bumps and designs." Several jury members exchanged glances. One woman was furiously taking notes. Mr. Johnson moved closer to the evidence table and held up a plastic bag containing a silver ring. Even from across the room, the skull design was visible. "Is this the ring you saw?" Emma leaned forward slightly, Max moving with her. "Yes," she said definitively, "that's the ring." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The ring was critical evidence. It had been found in his apartment during his arrest, but he had never been cooperative about explaining how he obtained it. Now, Emma had just directly connected him to having worn it on the day of the crime. "What happened after you saw the man put the purse in the car?" Mr. Johnson asked. "He ran," Emma said. "He saw Max barking and he got scared. He ran to a car, a black car. I remember the color because it was dark and it made him look even scarier. He got in and the car went really fast down the street. It was loud." "Did you see anything about the car? The license plate, any markings?" Emma shook her head. "It was too far away, but it was old. The paint was kind of faded." Mr. Johnson spent another 20 minutes with Emma, walking her through every detail of her recollection. allowing her to establish herself as a credible, observant witness. By the time he finished, it was clear that this was no confused child. This was a young girl with a sharp eye for detail, who had witnessed something traumatic and had processed it with surprising clarity. Then it was Mr.'s turn again. The defense attorney approached the witness stand with noticeably less confidence than before. He had seen what had happened. He had watched this child transform from a panicked, doubting mess into a composed, credible witness. He knew that aggressively attacking her again might backfire, might make her appear even more sympathetic to the jury. "Emma," he began, his tone more measured now, "you said the car was black. Are you certain it was black and not dark blue or dark gray?" "It was black," Emma said calmly, "I'm sure." "And the ring? Are you absolutely certain you saw a ring on this man's hand on September 19th, not some other day, not from your imagination?" Emma hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt but from the seriousness of the question. "I remember what I saw," she said. "I was looking at his hands because I was scared. When you're scared, you notice things. I noticed his hands because I didn't know if he would hurt me." The honesty in that response was devastating to the defense case. Several jury members looked uncomfortable, their sympathy visibly shifting toward Emma. Mr. tried a few more angles, but each time Emma remained steady. She didn't contradict herself. She didn't become confused or flustered. She simply answered truthfully, with the kind of certainty that comes from actual memory rather than coached recitation. By the time Mr. returned to his seat, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that he had lost. He had tried to break Emma's testimony and had failed. Over the next 2 hours, the prosecution presented additional evidence. Detective Martinez about the security footage showing at multiple crime scenes. A forensic analyst explained how they had matched fibers from his apartment to Emma's description of the red hoodie, and how they had found that same hoodie in his closet. Video evidence showed black sedan at 3 separate locations, where car break-ins had occurred on the same days he was caught on camera committing them. But the cornerstone of the prosecution's case remained Emma's testimony. Without her credible identification and her detailed recollection of the silver ring, many of the other pieces of evidence would have been circumstantial. With her testimony, they became part of an undeniable pattern. Judge watched it all unfold, her expression thoughtful and measured. She made notes throughout the afternoon, occasionally glancing at Emma, who remained calm throughout with Max's steady presence beside her. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the judge's initial skepticism about allowing the dog in her courtroom had been completely replaced by an appreciation for the accommodation's profound impact on the testimony's quality. As the court adjourned for the day, Judge made eye contact with Emma for just a moment. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a look that seemed to say, "You were brave today. You told the truth. And because of that, justice has a chance." Emma stood up on slightly wobbly legs, her hand gripping Max's leash. The dog pressed against her one final time, and Emma felt the weight of the day beginning to lift slightly. She had done it. She had delivered her testimony. She had been believed. Whatever happened next, she had already accomplished what she came to do. As she walked out of the courtroom with her parents, she could hear people talking in hushed tones, could feel eyes on her back. But for the first time since this ordeal began, those eyes didn't feel threatening. They felt understanding. They felt proud. The defense case collapsed almost immediately. The attorney presented his defense without much conviction, offering witness testimony from a friend who claimed had been somewhere else on the day of the crime. But the friend's account was vague, contradictory, and obviously rehearsed. Under cross-examination by Mr. Johnson, the defense witness admitted he hadn't actually checked the time when supposedly arrived at his house, and that he had been drinking that afternoon. It was the kind of desperate defense that made jurors roll their eyes. No physical evidence was presented to contradict the prosecution's case. No credible witnesses were called. Himself did not take the stand. a strategic decision that spoke volumes about the weakness of his position. By mid-afternoon on the second day of trial, the defense rested its case, and everyone in the courtroom knew that a guilty verdict was not just possible but probable. The waiting was agony. Jury deliberation began at 2:15 p.m. on Friday. Emma and her parents, along with Detective Martinez and the entire prosecution team, retreated to a waiting area outside the courtroom. Emma sat between her parents with Max's leash wrapped around her hand. Her mother held a cup of cold coffee that she kept forgetting to drink. Her father stared at the ceiling, occasionally checking his phone. Hours crept by with agonizing slowness. At 3:45 p.m., the bailiff appeared and told them the jury had reached a verdict. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. 3 hours and 30 minutes. The jurors had deliberated for 3 hours and 30 minutes. Most guilty verdicts in straightforward cases like this took at least 6 to 8 hours. Emma's mother had explained during one of their earlier conversations with the victim advocate. 3.5 hours suggested complete agreement among the jurors, a unanimous, decisive verdict. They filed back into the courtroom. Was brought in from the holding cell, his orange jumpsuit now visibly stained from the prison cafeteria food. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the certainty of what was coming. His attorney sat beside him with a grim expression, knowing that the battle was already lost. Emma was seated in the gallery between her parents. Judge entered and took her position at the bench. The courtroom rose. Then the jury filed back in, their expressions carefully neutral but their posture suggesting the weight of their decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman, a woman in her 60s wearing glasses and a determined expression, stood and held out a piece of paper to the bailiff. The bailiff retrieved the verdict form and handed it to Judge. The judge read it silently, and Emma watched her face intently, trying to discern some hint of what the verdict was. But judges were trained to reveal nothing through their expressions. "The defendant will please stand," Judge commanded. Stood slowly, his shackles rattling. His attorney stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Judge read from the verdict form. "On the charge of burglary in the first degree, how does the jury find?" "Guilty," the foreman said, her voice clear and unwavering. The word hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Emma felt her father's arm tighten around her shoulders. Her mother made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Max stood up and pressed his head against Emma's leg, as if offering congratulations. "On the charge of theft in the first degree, how does the jury find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of breaking and entering with intent to commit theft, how does the jury find?" "Guilty." One by one, the charges were read and guilty verdicts were returned. There were 7 counts in total, 7 guilty verdicts, a complete and utter repudiation of criminal actions. When the last verdict was read, his face seemed to crumble. He sank back into his chair, his head dropping. His attorney patted his shoulder but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Judge banged her gavel once firmly. "The jury is dismissed with the thanks of this court. Bailiff, the defendant is remanded to custody pending sentencing." As was being led away, he glanced back at Emma for just a moment. But there was no threat in his look anymore, no smugness or defiance. There was only the dull recognition of defeat. Then Judge did something extraordinary. "Before this court adjourns," she said, her voice taking on a formal, almost ceremonial quality, "I feel compelled to make a statement for the record." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone settled back into their seats, sensing that something important was about to be said. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge began, "I have presided over hundreds of trials. I have seen many forms of evidence presented: forensic evidence, technological evidence, expert testimony. But today, I have witnessed something that has profoundly moved me and given me cause to reconsider some of my long-held beliefs about courtroom procedure." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Emma. The testimony provided by the young witness in this case was, by any measure, extraordinary. Not because she provided the most damaging evidence, though she certainly did that, but because she demonstrated something that transcends the technical requirements of testimony. She demonstrated courage. She demonstrated clarity of recollection. She demonstrated an ability to tell the truth even when that truth was being aggressively challenged. Judge leaned forward slightly. However, the aspect of this trial that has most captured my attention is the role played by the service dog. I initially granted permission for the dog to be present in my courtroom with considerable reluctance. I was concerned about the precedent, about the potential for disruption, about whether accommodations might somehow undermine the integrity of judicial proceedings. Emma held her breath, listening intently. "I was wrong," Judge said simply. "The service dog's presence did not undermine the testimony. It strengthened it. By providing the witness with emotional support and grounding, the dog enabled this child to give clearer, more credible, more detailed testimony than would likely have been possible otherwise. The jury's guilty verdict stands as testimony to that credibility. Justice was served today not despite the accommodation, but in many ways because of it." The judge paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of finality that suggested a decision had been made. "Effective immediately, I am revising the official policy of this courthouse to permit certified service animals in courtrooms during the testimony of child witnesses. Furthermore, I am recommending to the Judicial Conference that this accommodation be considered by all judges within our district. Our commitment to justice must include a commitment to supporting our most vulnerable witnesses, our children. If allowing a trained animal in the courtroom enables a child to testify more effectively and truthfully, then we have not only followed the letter of justice, we have honored its spirit." The courtroom erupted in whispers. This was unprecedented. This was a judge taking an extraordinary step, creating policy based on a single case's extraordinary circumstances. Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Her mother pulled her close. Her father reached over and stroked Max's head gratefully. Detective Martinez was on her feet, moving toward the prosecution table. She was smiling broadly, and when she caught Emma's eye, she gave her a small, respectful nod. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. But the Richardson family didn't stop to answer. They moved directly toward the exit, holding Emma close, Max walking protectively beside them. As they descended the courthouse steps into the late afternoon sunlight, Emma felt something shift inside her. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks, ever since that day on Maple Street when she had witnessed the crime, lifted. Not completely, not entirely, but significantly. Justice had been served, was going to prison, and more importantly, something larger had changed. The system had recognized the importance of supporting vulnerable witnesses. The next child who had to testify would have a smoother path, clearer accommodations, a better chance of being heard. Emma looked up at her mother. "It's over," she asked. Her mother knelt down and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "It's over, sweetheart, it's over." 6 months after his conviction, Emma Richardson stood in front of her second-grade class to give a presentation on My Summer. While most of her classmates talked about trips to the beach or visits to grandparents' houses, Emma's contribution was notably different. She talked about learning to ride a bike, about winning a soccer game, and about how her dog Max had helped her through a scary time. She didn't provide details about the trial. That wasn't appropriate for 7-year-olds. But she spoke about courage and how asking for help was brave, not weak. Mrs., her teacher, watched with quiet pride. She had noticed the change in Emma over the months. The withdrawn, anxious child who had stared out the windows in September had gradually transformed back into the engaged, thoughtful, and genuinely kind second grader she had been before the incident on Maple Street. But the impact of Emma's testimony extended far beyond her small classroom. 2 months after the trial ended, Detective Sarah Martinez received 3 phone calls from women in the neighborhood. Each of them had been victims of car break-ins, but they hadn't come forward initially because they feared the prosecution wouldn't be able to prove the cases. After hearing about Emma's testimony and conviction, they gained confidence that the system could work. Their evidence, combined with now established pattern of behavior, resulted in additional charges being filed. By the end of the summer, faced a total of 11 counts of burglary, theft, and breaking and entering. His sentence increased from 4 years to 8 years in prison. The implications were significant. 8 years instead of 4 meant nearly double the time would spend incarcerated, preventing him from victimizing other people in his community for a much longer period. In the autumn of that year, an article about Emma's case was published in the Oregon Law Review, a prestigious academic journal. Professor Robert, a law professor at the University of Oregon, had written a detailed analysis of how child witness accommodation could improve testimony quality. The article was titled, "Grounding Truth: Service Animals and Childhood Testimony in Criminal Proceedings." Professor requested permission from Emma's parents to cite their daughter's case as a model for how courts could better serve vulnerable witnesses. Emma's parents granted permission, and suddenly, their daughter's name appeared in legal journals and began to be discussed in law schools across the country. Law professors used the case to teach their students about witness accommodation, trauma-informed justice, and the importance of thinking creatively about how to improve judicial proceedings. But the most significant impact came in the form of legislative change. A year after Emma's testimony, State Senator Williams from Portland read about Emma's case and became fascinated by its implications. She reached out to Judge, who provided her with detailed information about the courtroom accommodations and their measurable impact on testimony quality. Senator Williams began working with a coalition of child advocacy groups, judges, and victims' rights organizations to draft comprehensive legislation that would formally recognize and protect the use of service animals in courtrooms nationwide. The legislation, which came to be known colloquially as Emma's Law, included several key provisions. First, it required all states to establish formal policies permitting certified service animals in courtrooms during the testimony of child witnesses under 18 years old. Second, it mandated that judges receive training on trauma-informed practices when dealing with child witnesses. Third, it provided funding for courtroom accommodations, including private waiting areas, screens to shield witnesses from defendant confrontation when appropriate, and video testimony options. Fourth, it recognized the specific role that service animals could play in reducing anxiety and improving communication in vulnerable witnesses. By the time Emma was 10 years old, 12 states had passed versions of Emma's Law. By the time she was 13, 30 states had adopted similar legislation. The impact was measurable. Child testimony became more detailed, more consistent, and more credible across the board. Conviction rates in cases involving child witnesses increased significantly. Emma herself was largely unaware of these legislative changes until her 13th birthday, when her therapist, Dr. Lisa, sat down with her and explained what had happened as a result of her courage. "Do you remember when you in court?" Doctor asked gently. Emma nodded. She remembered it as one would remember a vivid dream, clearly but from a distance, as if it had happened to someone else. "What you did that day has changed how the legal system treats child witnesses across the entire country," Doctor explained. "Your case is taught in law schools. There's legislation named after you. Judges have changed their policies because of your testimony." Emma stared at her therapist in disbelief. "Really?" "Really?" Doctor confirmed. "You did something remarkable, Emma. You were brave when you needed to be brave. And that bravery created change that will help thousands of children who come after you." Emma didn't know what to say. She had never thought of herself as someone who changed things. She was just a girl who had witnessed a crime and had to tell people about it. But hearing it framed this way, understanding that her testimony had created ripples that extended far beyond prison cell, shifted something fundamental in her self-perception. At home, Max was aging gracefully into his senior years. The golden retriever was 13 years old now, his muzzle completely gray, his movements slightly slower than they once had been. But his eyes remained sharp and attentive. He still slept on the floor beside Emma's bed every night. He still responded to her anxiety signals with the same steady, grounded pressure that had changed everything in that courtroom years ago. Emma's parents had explained to her that Max wouldn't live forever, that dogs aged faster than humans, and that she should treasure every moment with him. Emma understood this intellectually, but emotionally, she couldn't imagine her life without Max. The dog had been her anchor through the most frightening period of her childhood. He had been there when she needed him most. On a quiet afternoon in her 7th grade year, Emma sat at the kitchen table with her mother, looking through old newspaper articles about the trial. There were photos of her walking up the courthouse steps, photos of Detective Martinez looking satisfied with the verdict, photos of Judge making her policy announcement. But the photos Emma lingered over were the ones showing her and Max together in the courtroom. "I was so scared," Emma said quietly, looking at her own 7-year-old face in the photograph. Her mother squeezed her hand, "But you did it anyway." "Because of Max," Emma said. "Because of you and Max," her mother corrected. "Max helped you, but you gave the signal. You decided to be brave. That was you, Emma." Emma looked out the window, where Max was lying on the grass in the backyard, soaking up the sunshine. The dog's chest rose and fell steadily, peacefully. In that moment, Emma understood something profound. She was no longer the frightened 7-year-old girl who had witnessed a crime. She was someone who had transformed her fear into action, and that action had changed the world. Not the entire world, perhaps, but her world and the worlds of countless children who would testify in courtrooms in the future. Years later, when Emma was in college studying criminal justice, she would volunteer as a peer support advocate for child witnesses in ongoing trials. She would tell them about her own experience, about Max, about the power of asking for help. She would explain that being afraid didn't make you weak, it made you human, and that using the tools and support available to you made you strong. But that was all in the future. For now, on this peaceful afternoon, Emma simply sat with her mother and her aging dog, grateful for the journey they had taken together, and aware that though the trial was long behind them, its impact would ripple forward for generations to come. Max, sensing her attention, lifted his head and made his way slowly to where Emma sat. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and the dog leaned into her embrace. No signal was needed this time. Just love, and the quiet understanding that they had changed each other's lives in ways that would never stop mattering.